All right. Hi, everybody. This is Walt Rakowich. Some of you watching will know me personally and professionally, but for those of you who don't, I'm the former CEO of Prologis, and today I sit on 3 corporate boards and currently write and I speak about leadership. Since retiring from Prologis, I've been watching the state of leadership over the course of the last few years, and I've come to realize that what I learned, I could share with everybody. And I do that in my new book called Transfluence, where I talk about what I call transformative influence and the opportunity that we have to make an incredible impact in the lives of those that we lead. So about a month ago, I did my very first LinkedIn Live. I did it with Sally Helgeson, and I think she makes an incredibly positive impact on women in leadership. Today, I'm here for another LinkedIn Live, and this time I'm welcoming leadership expert, acclaimed speaker, and author Drew Dudley. Recognized as one of the most dynamic keynote speakers in the world, Drew has spoken to over 250,000 people on 5 continents, and his TED Talk has been voted one of the 15 most inspirational TED Talks of all time. That's impressive. I've read his fantastic book. It's called This Is Day One, and I'm happy to welcome Drew here to a conversation about leadership today. Drew, welcome on board.
Hey, Walt, it is awesome to be here. I'm so glad to get a chance to talk to you, my friend.
Man, I'm glad to have you too. Before we get started, I have to tell you that I loved your book. I absolutely loved your book, every part of it. Thing that really hit home to me was that we're all leaders. We're actually all leaders, and we lead in times that we don't even know we're leading. And it's really about our behaviors, and we need to be cognizant of that at all times. And so I'm really looking forward to talking to you about that in more depth. And so let me just launch right in. Obviously, you're internationally acclaimed and a best-selling author. But let's step backward. What experiences caused you to write your book in the first place? And can you kind of summarize a little bit about the principles as you think about leadership?
Yeah, you know what it is, my friend? All of my experiences led to the book. I think any of us who write a book, I mean, you as well, when you really take a step back and say what drove it, it's everything, right? Like I think I said this in the book. It's weird to say that I think I said this in the book because and anybody else there who's writing, like you can't even remember what stayed in, what got cut. And I think I told you, Walt, we first talked, that you eventually get your book published when you give up on any hope of liking it. But it was the sum total of experiences that I think did it. And there were a number of things that sort of really pushed it, though. For me, what happened was a big part of the book is driven by my experiences running the leadership development program at the University of Toronto, which is Canada's biggest university. And what I found was I was surrounded by these extraordinary young people. Working at a university means that you're always surrounded by people who are half your age and twice as smart as you. Our entire goal in the education system is to graduate them before they figure out they're twice as smart as we are. Otherwise, the entire system collapses. But they wouldn't call themselves leaders. They just wouldn't. And I think it's because from a really young age, we are taught that we're training to be leaders. The whole education system is about do what we tell you, and eventually you will get to this non-defined point where you're in charge or you've earned the right to become a leader. And I think that one of the big scams in the world, and we can dive down that hole another time, is the university and colleges, higher education's like stranglehold on this idea with young people that you cannot call yourself a leader until you get external permission to do it. You need our letters after your name. And even the business world buys into that, right? Because you need this experience to even have a chance to interview here. And that over years, it has its impact on everyone. We all went through that system, and it diminishes us. It tells us that we're reliant on the education system for validation, and then we're reliant on the company that hires us and pays us for validation of our leadership. And we treat leadership as if it's something we need permission to use. And I watch these young people who fought for social justice, raised money for charity, contributed massively to their communities and to each other and to their families, especially at a university with a lot of first-generation students. they're taking care of their brothers and their sisters and working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school, and no, wouldn't call themselves leaders. And I started to realize that this is not an unusual phenomenon, that from a very young age, we're taught to make leadership into something bigger than us and beyond us. We're given examples of leaders, which is the easiest way to teach people a new idea, examples. And they're all presidents and scientific groundbreakers and people who conquer empires. And so I started to realize that, in my opinion, most of the most profound impact on my life on a daily basis came from individuals who didn't see themselves as leaders. And I started to realize it's because we've tied leadership so tightly to money, titles, accolades over the years. And when people are young, or when people are at the lower end of the economic spectrum or compensation spectrum, we've been trained to immediately think of ourselves as less than. And when I say everyone's a leader, I know a lot of people roll their eyes because we're taught leadership is this small club that not everyone can or should get into. And I think we should recognize that when we say everyone can be a leader, what we effectively are doing to some people is attacking how much work they put on in their own mind, right? They're like, well, if everyone's a leader, doesn't that diminish my degree from Harvard? Doesn't that diminish my senior vice president title or my Mercedes or whatever it is? And so I think that some people find it to be, without diving too deep into the idea, that, oh, wow, you're destroying what we believe is so important, which is meritocracy. And I'm not saying everyone should be a CEO. I'm not saying that everybody can or wants to be a senior manager or a CEO. But I am saying there's a form of leadership to which we all can and should aspire. And the book is about reframing our understanding that we should evaluate our leadership over looking at our behaviors on a daily basis, as opposed to titles and accolades and things earned over time. That's the big piece, is that I'm not claiming that everyone should run a company, or that we need to get rid of bureaucracy, or we need to get rid of structured leadership roles, which are really accountability roles within organizations. But what I am saying is that we've created a world where the vast majority of the leadership on the planet is coming from people who don't think they're leaders. Because we're ignoring what I think leadership's foundation is, which is individual moments of interpersonal impact, moments of kindness, empathy, forgiveness, the type of powerful moments that we can all create. And what we've happened is they've been diminished and called the little things that you do every day. And they're being ignored for what they are: leadership and power. And I think it's important to recognize individual leadership and power through our behaviors each day, because it's pretty much the only source of power on earth that is accessible to everyone on earth. Like
So
sorry, go ahead.
No. So I was going to say the perfect example of that is the Lollipop Story. Drew, you got to tell the Lollipop Story. I know you've told it a million times, but I love it, and I think it's great for this audience to hear.
Well, yeah, sure. You know, it's sort of the story that I tell to summarize the idea that we've become convinced our legacy is built over long periods of time, and I think there's some truth to that. But what I really wanted to get through to people was where our true impact is, and that it's usually not where we're looking. We put a lot of focus on how do we look on paper and what have we accomplished and what are our titles. And the Lollipop Story was a story that I started to recount to the volunteers of a charity that I ran. And there were all these students, about 30,000 of them across the country, that went out to raise money each year through our campaign for Cystic Fibrosis Canada. And what happened was they started to tie their concept of success to how much money they raised. And it's a fundraiser. We wanted them to raise money, but we'd lose volunteers. They wouldn't answer our emails because they said they wanted to make 5,000 or 10,000 and didn't hit the goal. And so they started writing off this 4-month contribution they had made to our organization as a failure. And so I started to tell this story at the end of our annual training conference. And because I thought it got to the heart of what leadership and culture change really was. And the story, it was involved on one of my last days at my first university. I was there forever. I was taught letters after your name make you smarter. So I just stayed at my first university forever. And at my last night, a young woman came up to me at my farewell party, which the university had paid for. That's how bad they wanted me out of there. And she told me that, I remember the first time I ever met you. And then she told me a story that was actually 4 years old. And it turns out, she said, the night before I started school, after years of being so excited about the prospect of going away to school, the night before it starts, I'm just racked with this terrible self-doubt. And it was so overwhelming that I just started to cry. It just beat me up so bad. And my parents, they hadn't seen me cry in a long time, but they said, look, we know you're scared. We're way more scared than you are. You owe it to yourself to try. So here's the thing. We'll go on to campus tomorrow to register. And once we're on the campus, like we're out of this hotel room and we're there, if you still feel this way, we will take you home. We love you no matter what. But if you don't at least go to the campus tomorrow, you'll regret it the rest of your life. And our job as parents is to make sure that doesn't happen. And she said, I knew they were right. I got in line. And on the first day, standing in line, everyone was yelling. It's so noisy when you bring a bunch of new people into a community, and they had matching face paint and matching t-shirts. They were doing coordinated cheers. One thing I always tell people is I think it's because the people who plan welcome activities to anything are always extroverts, right? They plan extrovert fun, highly interactive, very noisy. And for every introvert, it's not your idea of a good time. And she told me I was standing in line on the first day and I just quit because I said to myself, like, this is another place where only extroverts are valued. And I won't spend 4 more years of my life at a place where you have to yell to fit in. And I always tell culture creators to bear that phrase in mind as you start to create cultures for individuals. Are we creating an environment where introverts say, this is a place where only extroverts are valued? I have to yell to fit in. And she said, so I quit. And as soon as I quit, incredible feeling of peace comes over me. And I know it's the right decision. And I turned to mom and dad to tell them that. And before I could say it, you come bursting out of this nearby building and you're wearing a big stupid hat and a sign that says students fighting cystic fibrosis. And you're walking along the lineup and you're handing out lollipops and you're trying to make people laugh and get them to do your charity in the morning. And she goes, you get to me and you just kind of stare at me for quite a while. And then you turn to the guy next to me and you hold out a lollipop to him from your bucket and you say, man, you have to stand next to this incredibly beautiful woman for the next 2.5 hours and you're not talking to her. Like, man, break the ice. Give her this lollipop. Give her the lollipop. And I always have to pause the story now, which is too bad because it kills the flow. But I have to acknowledge that I did not respect her personal space there. And that statement was incredibly heteronormative. But we'll play this one to the end. And she says, he turns beet red, won't even look at me, just holds the lollipop out, like stoically staring straight ahead. And I feel so bad for him. I take it. And as soon as I take it, your whole demeanor changes. And you look so disappointed and you turn to my parents and you say, would you look at your little girl? Like, look at your daughter. It's her first day away from home. Like her first day without mom and dad to hold her hand. And already she's taking candy from a stranger. Nice parenting. And she goes, everybody loses it. They're laughing in every direction. And for some reason, the laughter just changed something in me. And I said, okay, I won't quit now. And I guess I assumed I'd quit the next day. And then the next day, somebody did something similar and I put it off again. And look, eventually I stopped thinking about quitting and I graduate in a few weeks and I haven't talked to you in the 4 years since that happened. But I had to tell you that before you left, that you have been an incredibly important person in my life and I'm going to miss you. So good luck. And walks away. Which you shouldn't do. Like, you can't tell that story and drop the mic and wander off. And I was standing there stunned, but she came back and she said, there's one more thing that you should probably know. And I have been dating that guy for 4 years since you introduced us that morning. And then 1.5 years after I moved 1,000 miles away, she and he invited me to their wedding. Like, she married the guy. And I think the big thing that I wanted to get across to those volunteers back then, and as I continue to tell the story, is that, like, I don't remember that. Like, I've searched my memory for that moment, and I have no recollection of it. And that was the big thing, is that maybe the biggest moment of leadership in my life, maybe the biggest impact I ever had on another human being, is a moment I don't remember. And I told them that because I wanted them to realize that, yes, they were going to raise a certain amount of money that year, but the true change in the culture, because that campaign has gone on to be named the best campaign in the country. It has won all kinds of fundraising awards at this school. And when we took it over, it was the worst fundraising campaign in the country. And it took 7 years after we were done as leaders of that organization for some of the foundation that we built to start making that possible. And you lay on leaders who were better or more more amazing than we were, but they were able to build on what we created. And I wanted to get across to people that many of the biggest moments of leadership in your life that define who you are, that define what people think of you, are in those individual moments. They're the things that you don't even remember. And we made leadership about changing the world. And I guess my message is always, there is no world, there's 9 billion understandings of it. And so leadership is about changing people's understanding of the world, their understanding of their place in it, how many people care about them, what they're capable of, how big an agent for change they can be in the world, or I think just as importantly, how big an agent for change they can be in their own life. And leadership gets talked a lot about where you are, how much influence you have, like whether you're in a position where you can create long-term vision, and that is a form of leadership. But to me, we've spent so much time trying to achieve things and acquire things. We've been taught that we've lost sight of the fact that the primary determinant of how people view us and how we view ourselves as leaders is how we behave on a day-to-day basis. And for me, I want people to start realizing that the true power in changing things, whether you have a title or not, is whether or not you create these powerful moments of interpersonal impact. And the whole book, the whole concept of my work is to not just stand here and say we should think about leadership differently, but how do we do it? How do we stop ignoring the leadership around us? How do we put more focus on everyday behaviors of leadership as opposed to the long-term impact of engaging in those behaviors? Because leadership's not doing extraordinary things. It's doing ordinary things with extraordinary consistency. And I want people to recognize it. And I also want them to start to plan for it. I think that's a big piece. And I promise to give you shorter answers moving forward.
No, I love that. And as a matter of fact, you talk in your book about there are 6 key leadership values, and you talk about impact and courage and empowerment, growth, class, self-respect. These are things you have to do in a book, and I get that. But the stories are the powerful things. Because the stories are the things that hit me. And of course, in my book, I talk a lot about the importance of influence. So in some respects, your impact is kind of my influence. And there's another story you told in the book, which just was terrific. It was I call it the caramel candy story. And it was underneath of that whole idea of impact. And it had a lot to do with the little things that you just talked about. I want to hear, can you talk to the audience a little bit about the caramel candy story as well?
Yeah, I want to just point out too is people say little things and they mean only the best when they say it, right? They mean these individual micro moments and interactions where you take a second and you say, this is not hard and I will choose to do it. And although it's not difficult, it will have a very profound impact. But one of the things I always recommend is let's steer clear of the term little things and let's talk about simple things. Because I think it gets the same concept across, which is this is quite possible to do without major time or resource investment with a big impact, but they're not little. So it's our instinct to call them little and they're not. And the idea you say influence, impact, the words aren't so much important as our understanding of them. So one of the things I always say is we throw words around we want to live up to and we don't define them. So when we talk with students, and this is what the book's all about, is actually how you define the things you want to define you. And you and I could probably define these key words, influence, impact, for ourselves. Like that's it. That's all that matters is how we define them and whether we live up to them. Because, before I tell the story, I just want to say, I developed 6 key leadership values for ourselves, for our students, for me. They're not the 6 key leadership values, right? My work is helping people figure out those. But what happened was we decided that we wanted to live this value of impact. But our argument was you can't hit a target that you don't define. So we had to define what impact was. And we said, okay, it's a commitment to, those 3 words are so key to my work, a commitment to, because it demands, to end that sentence, behaviors. So we said, it's a commitment to creating moments that cause people to feel as if they're better off for having interacted with you. And that became a mission. And, without diving too deeply into the psychological research underpinnings of this work, we turned it into a question. What have I done today to recognize someone else's leadership? Because behavioral psychology says questions are more likely to cause you to engage in behavior than goals, than orders. So what we effectively did was say, okay, we're going to go out and find a way to answer, what did I do today to recognize someone else's leadership? And every time we find a way to answer this question, we've lived impact. And that was a week-long assignment. And very soon after coming up with this assignment, what happened was I went out to a grocery store, and it was one of those days where the lineups are so long, you actually have to go down the aisle to get into a lineup. And I stood in line, and I look ahead, and the cashier was on a mission. Like, she was checking stuff through as if her life depended on it. I've never seen anybody move stuff through a cash this fast. And what I found interesting is nobody was nice to her about it. Nobody even seemed to notice. Like, it's one thing to look at someone negatively, but I think it hurts even more when you look right through them, when you don't even see them as a person, right? And she's asking people questions, and they won't look up from their phones, yeah, whatever. And I actually watched people be rude. Like, I actually watched one guy on the course of this, I don't know, like 10 minutes I was in line, maybe even longer. He actually went, "Hey, hon." And anybody who's worked in the service industry had the same reaction to the finger snap. Like, everyone in the service industry should be allowed to taser one person here, no questions asked. But that's going to clean us up. But people were so mean to her. They either ignored her, or they were openly frustrated at how long they were in line, despite the fact they'd be in line twice as long if it wasn't for how hard this woman was working. And so all of a sudden I get up to the counter, and I realized, like, here's my chance to answer that question. Part of the whole psychology of our process is your brain will look for chances to answer a question once that question's in your brain. And so I said, here's my chance to do it. And so I said to the cashier, as I start putting my stuff on the belt, I said, well, excuse me, which one of these chocolates do you like the best? Because they stick them right up in front. And she snapped at me. She was just like, caramels. And what I often say is, like, there's words in the English language you never expect to be snapped at you in anger. And caramels is on that. Like, there's some words that don't sound right when people say them pissed, like bubbles or kittens. Like, you can't say bubbles angrily. And so it caught me aside. So I throw it on the thing, and she beeps it through, as my mom likes to say. And I stopped her and I said, actually, I got those for you. Like, I've been watching you for however long here, and you've been killing yourself at this job, and nobody seems to care. And I just wanted to let you know, I haven't seen anybody in your job this committed to it, and it inspires me. And I teach leadership at the university, and I wanted to let you know this is what I talk about when I talk about real leadership. So thank you, right? And I just wanted to make her smile. Like, I was just trying to answer this question as part of a social experiment, and she starts to cry. Like, it's not what I'm looking for, man. And I'm Canadian, so I've apologized to inanimate objects over which I've tripped. And so I'm freaking out, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And she just said, I'm sorry, it's just no one's even been polite to me today, and you bought me chocolates. I don't know how to process this. And her phrase, no one's ever been polite to me today, has really been something that stuck with me, and I often pass this on to individuals. As difficult as it is when we're having a tough time to put ourselves in other people's shoes, one of the tricks I try to use is that imagine as you approach someone new, whether in the service industry or not, imagine to yourself not a single person has been polite to this person today. And there's almost an excitement that comes from thinking, oh my God, I have the ability to be the first person to make this person feel good today. Like, there's almost an excitement that comes from that. And so that experience has really impacted me since then, because I often will think to myself as I engage in a behavior, particularly at this time with people in the service industry, I don't, like, just imagine no one's been polite to this person all day, and you get the chance to be the first one who did. It'll matter so much to them. And that was a real eye-opener for me, that a moment of buying someone some chocolate, honestly, because I promised my students that I'd participate in this initiative as well, could make someone cry. Like, what experience do you have all day to try at someone doing one thing nice for you? And to realize that in any given day, we're going out there into the world, interacting with a bunch of people who've had that done to them. And you know what we've seen in the last 6 months too is that we've got people out there in the world who have spent entire lives feeling like people are doing that to them, entire lives, entire cultural groups who have spent years feeling as if they are not seen by other people. And the ability to create those moments on an individual level and on a social level has a wild and extraordinary impact. And I think that what happens is we just let our to-do list get in the way of us seeing these opportunities. And what we tried to develop was a process so that in the course of your day, it becomes much harder to ignore opportunities to live the values you care about because you're so busy meeting all the obligations you make to other people.
Yeah. You know what, Drew, I got to tell you, that is a powerful story. And I almost apologize. I want to apologize by saying the little things, because they may seem like the little bit things, but they really turn out to be very, very big things. You know, you don't think of every moment of your life as being that big, but it really is. And the impact that you made on that woman that day is just incredible.
Yeah, and I apologize. I wasn't trying to like correct you there. I just always sort of catch how easy it is for us to do it.
No, it's very easy. And so I'm going to turn that around a little bit. You know, we both talk about leadership as sort of conscientiously choosing to influence other people through the things that you're talking about. But, you know, we live in a world of a pandemic. We live in a world where there's protests, there's, you know, social injustice, the political and social divisions that we see, particularly in this country. And really brought into even sharper focus as it relates to the U.S. elections. You know, how do you manage to hold on to and espouse this form of leadership that focuses on the positive impact, and when there's just so many frustrating things that are going on around us?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you the answer to that, and I mean, I'm struggling with it recently. The election, particularly, and I'm sorry, I'm catching a bit of a reverb. So I'm just trying to fix something here. I wish it's difficult. It's incredibly difficult to do recently, and I think that's why it's so important that the process that we try to approach, it almost tricks your brain into doing it because it's so easy to get cynical. And I've really struggled. And I know it's weird because I wrote a book on this and I give presentations on it, but I've also wanted to be very open with people that I'm finding it very hard to separate my anger and frustration at some of the behaviors of individuals who have been entrusted with those types of leadership roles that everyone looks at, the archetype, you know, the archetype of leadership in the United States, you know, senators, etc. The example that they're putting on is the exact opposite of, like, if you take a look at the leadership in the, you know, your country, all of our countries, particularly your country, like, we wouldn't let 8-year-olds like this. We'd call it out, right? Like, we'd want to correct this. And so I just want to be clear to people that I really struggle to do what you just said, and I teach how to do it, and I find it so hard to do and to not be cynical. And so I think that one thing I want to let people know is that it's okay to feel that. It's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to be angry. But the difference is whether or not you allow that frustration and anger to be translated into your behaviors. I mean, everybody feels emotions of fear and anger. Hell, we even get tribal constantly because historically it helped us survive. Right? Like, things like fear and jealousy and anger, when the primary threats to our well-being as humans were physical for tens of thousands of years, those served us well. But what happened is the social world changes so much faster than the physical world that we're still living in a world where now we're living in a world where the primary threats to our well-being are social and emotional. And we still have a brain that's hardwired to make us survive in a world where the biggest threats are physical. And so the challenge is to stop judging ourselves for those feelings we have inside, because people say it's not what happens to you, it's how you react to it. And I just want to politely say I don't believe that to be true, because I don't believe we can control reactions. Reactions are built into our DNA, they're instincts, and they exist to keep us alive. We can't control our reactions, and we need to stop telling people that they should judge themselves if they can't. What we can control are our responses to those reactions. because the difference between responding and reacting is one simple act, but it's a big act, and that's thinking. Responses involve thinking and evaluating. Reactions do not. And we cannot control our reactions, but we can control our responses to them. And so what I do is I've tried to forgive myself for not being the pure-hearted, amazing person that I think we're taught we're supposed to be, especially if you're a speaker who talks about positive impact. Sometimes every thought we have that isn't like the lollipop dude, sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, I feel guilty of it because somehow I talk about how we can be better than that, and that makes us judge ourselves. So for me, it's about being able to forgive yourself for the darkest thoughts that you have and have a process in place that makes sure that those negative thoughts don't translate into behaviors that are consistent with those ideas. And so part of that is recognizing that when I embrace the worst parts of my mind, the worst impulses I have, I'm actually recognizing my humanity and embracing the fact that unlike most creatures on the planet, I can then choose to not have my behavior align with the worst parts of my thoughts. And I think that's a big piece. And I think that taking a step back beyond that, and that's the whole day one process, which I don't want to bore people with here, because it does involve like a behavioral psychology and how to make sure that you transfer those behaviors. But what I think is key is to forgive yourself for having those thoughts, not to judge yourself as a bad person, and to recognize it's the behaviors that define you, not necessarily the worst that you have. And in terms of like the examples being given out there in the world, one of the things I think, or I want people to start considering, is that we give the term leader to both good and bad behavior because we're evaluating leadership based on the amount of influence someone gains. And we call them leaders, no matter whether they gain that influence through the exploitation of others, through self-centered decisions and behaviors that hurt other people, or whether they gain that influence because their mission in life is to expand people's rights, expand people's opportunities to feel good about themselves. And we give them the same title, though. We say this person is the leader, even though they stepped on people's throats to get there. You can't argue with Steve Jobs' results, right? Even though his way of getting there was a tyrannical way of hurting other people in terms of emotional and the way that they were treated. But at the same time, we still say it's a leader. You can't argue with the result. You can't argue that this person isn't a leader. They managed to become president of the United States or prime minister of Canada. And my argument is that we should start to consider teaching the outcomes of those two different types of behaviors as different things. Leaders are only leaders when they gain influence through an attempt to serve other people, to expand other people's opportunities, their rights, their dignity. Those are leaders. Individuals who still succeed in making money, gaining profile, gaining fame, gaining influence, but they do it through the damage of other people or through self-serving. I think we shouldn't call them leaders. I think that we should recognize that the outcome of that type of behavior, like gaining influence, is a different animal altogether. I call them catalysts for harm because all leaders are catalysts, but not all catalysts are leaders. And so for me, I call them catalysts for harm. And for what it's worth, I think if we start looking at it differently, we stop allowing young people to believe that they get the choice on which one of these to choose because one of them is much easier than the other. To get to be a leader by being self-serving is much easier than the decisions that go with the other one. So I always tell people, particularly students, to look out for how someone uses fear. I believe that catalysts for harm add fear in an effort to win, and that leaders try to remove fear in order to help people succeed. And I think that we can look at the world and people who are in influence and start to realize, stop referring to them all as leaders, whether good or bad, and start to realize there's categories of individuals here. And for me, I get a little bit less disillusioned about leadership when I stop allowing people who don't deserve the title to be considered as such in my mind, and to try to encourage other people to do the same thing. But I just wanted to say, in answer to that question, it's okay to be cynical, but it's not okay for your behaviors to be cynical. And sometimes it's really, really hard, and I've struggled very hard since my girlfriend died 3 years ago. There's a lot of anger and bitterness and cynicism I have for the world. And that has been really hard to do. And for a long time, I hid it because I'm supposed to be the lollipop guy. And instead, I started to embrace the fact that maybe there are some people out there who want to know that even those of us who dedicated our career to highlighting the powerful positive impact we can have on other people struggle to do it. It's hard. And the work that I do is my way of giving myself ammunition, my better angels, ammunition against the darkest parts of me. Because let's face it, your better angels, when it comes to the demons, your demons are way better funded and have better ammo. And so the processes I teach are my attempt to better equip my better angels to do battle with the darker parts of my life, because we all got it. And I never want to give the impression that because you write a book about transfluence, influence, I write a book about impact. I think people read it, they see us speak, and they're like, "Oh, that person has it figured out." No, don't have it figured out. Working hard every day to do it, though, because that's what defines us.
Well, and speaking of that, I know it's a hard question for me to ask, but you referred to it, so you opened the door up a little bit. And I have to admit, when I read your last chapter of your book, my heart sank. It just did. It's a tough story, and I think it would bring most people to their knees. I know it had a profound impact on you, and you talked about your girlfriend. So, but it's not brought you down. So since we're talking about the negative and how you deal with it, let me just ask you that as a final question, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that story and how you dealt with it.
Yeah, it's interesting too, as you say, it didn't bring me down. It really has brought me down, but it hasn't kept me. It didn't knock me out, right? And I think that we talk a lot about strength in this world, and I think that people assume they're supposed to be strong, which means they're not allowed to break. And what I found is that strength isn't nearly as important as resilience in this world. I met the love of my life. It took me 38 years to do it, which is odd too, because there's people out there, I'm sure, who think there's this hole in your life because you haven't found that person yet. And we're taught that we're supposed to find it between the ages of like 24 and 28 and then get married and have kids. I didn't discover the thing I was born to do till I was 27 years old. I didn't meet the person that I loved more than anything in the world till I was 38. And, she was sexually assaulted in the summer of 2016, and died. I didn't find out until the fall of that year because, I don't have to tell many of the women watching how difficult it is, and I shouldn't even say it because who am I to say it? But I watched the impact it had on her, and finally she revealed this had happened because she was ashamed of it. She was ashamed of it. And she died by suicide on January 17th of 2017. Never recovered from the attack, which is part of the reason I struggle with what some of the leaders in the world are doing, because they so dismiss the idea that this happens to women. But it was so difficult to process that. It still impacts me. The funny thing is, you still discover ways it impacts you as you go along. A year from losing somebody, you're going through different things than right afterwards. But one of the things that I discovered in this world is that people out there saying you're not the only one is powerful. But I think the challenge is I'm just trying to figure out how to make this useful to other people as opposed to just a story about this wonderful woman who's not here anymore. I think the one thing that I'll say that the pandemic has also brought into sharp relief is that people going through this now, there's a couple of different types. There's a bunch of different types, but there are two categories in which you can put a lot of people. One, for whom the pandemic is the worst thing that's ever happened to them, and the other for when it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And what's very interesting is I'm finding that even though you expect people for whom are now taking a second punch to the gut, they've had this terrible thing and now they've got the pandemic. What's odd is I think I'm finding that individuals for whom this pandemic is not the worst thing that's ever happened to them are actually dealing with it better. And I think that says a lesson about the things that hurt us the most in the world. And maybe the best way I can talk about Anastasia's death is by saying this to people. There is a peace and a strength that comes from knowing that the worst thing that's ever happened to you, or the worst thing that could ever happen to you, has already happened. And there's a strength that comes from that. But even if the worst thing that could ever happen to you hasn't, I think it's wise to remember that the things that bring you closest to breaking are often the things that eventually do keep you from breaking. And one of the things when people think they can't get through something is I say to all of you, tell me about the last time You failed to get through a challenge in your life. Like you didn't make it. And for anybody to whom you get to say that, they don't have an answer. Like for a second you think you do, but you don't, because you're still here. Like every one of you has dealt with every problem you've ever faced because you're still here. That doesn't mean you're happy with how you dealt with it. It doesn't mean you don't have scars from dealing with it. It doesn't matter you don't have regrets. It doesn't mean you don't have regrets, but it does mean you got through it. And so you were batting 1,000 on getting through the difficult stuff in your life. And so I think that we shouldn't ignore that, because it's the knowledge that that's the case that I think can give us the strength to know we can get through the next thing. But what's odd is we have all of this evidence that we can do it. And yet every time we're faced with a new one, our instinct is this will be the time we fail. But if you've never failed at it before, what evidence do you have? And I know that evidence apparently isn't something we need anymore, but evidence you have, if you walk out the front door every day for 1,000 days and nobody hits you in the face with a pie, why on earth would it occur to us that someone's about to hit us in the face with a pie on the 1,001th time? My book is written because Anastasia found it in a drawer after I wrote it and was so afraid of putting out my ideas to the world that I hid it in a drawer for myself. She found it, she read it, she chewed me out and said, look, the only thing I asked for this year, 2017, and we were sitting on a beach on New Year's Day, and she said, all I ask is that you try to get it published. And if no one wants it, that's fine. But a year from today, what I hope to be true is that you can honestly say you tried. And I want you to promise me that. And because I cared about this person and she had more faith in my work than I did, I promised to do it. And then she died 17 days later. And so I couldn't possibly break the promise. But for me, there's two messages that come out of that experience. One, it takes time to recover. And it's not your emotions that destroy you. It's your judgments of yourself for having those emotions. For like, oh, I should be sadder now, or I should be crying, or I shouldn't be laughing because someone I love is gone. So, oh my God, I'm a terrible person for laughing. It wasn't my emotions that caused me problems after that. It's the judgments I made about the emotions I was having. So if I can take my story and try to make it useful for the people listening, which is really why you should tell stories. The few things I'd like to say is, one, strength is not as important as resilience. Two, what she reminded me of is that believing in the people you care about more than they believe in themselves can change their lives. Never stop doing it. And three, the scars that we have. Someone once wrote something that said, there is power in your pain and there is wisdom in your wounds. And to remember that instead of judging ourselves by or assuming that it's our fault that bad things have happened to us, recognizing that it's our source of strength. Those are what came out of, and that's my way of paying tribute to her, is to try to remind people, or to at least tell them her story, to remind people that we are much stronger than we think. And I remember I didn't cry after she died. Part of it was, I think, this is an intense answer, I know, but part of the challenge was that I found her along with her sister. And so not only do we lose someone, but there's that traumatic experience of the last thing you see of them. Mm-hmm. And I think that I do believe that that's been difficult to process. But I also know that it's given me an ability to face anything that comes next and say, you know what? I can get through this. There's power in your pain and there's wisdom in your wounds. And I think that there's just a power that comes from recognizing that. And I want to say to people that just remind yourself, you don't deserve the bad things that happen to you. You don't deserve them. You may be responsible for them and you should be accountable for them, but you don't deserve the worst things that have happened to you. You don't. And I think that we convince ourselves that we do. But I remember I didn't cry after she died, and I judged myself hard for it. I just couldn't do it. I don't know why. And it was so upsetting because I felt it demeaned her memory. And it was 3 months later, just to go full circle to you saying when you opened about stories, it was 3 months later, I'm driving through Idaho, going from one speech to another, and I'm listening to a podcast called The Moth. And this woman is talking about, they did an entire episode on loss and death. And I'm like, great, nice timing. But this woman told a story, and at the end of it, she said, grief is just love coming face to face with its oldest enemy. And there was something about that phrase that was exactly what I needed to hear to finally let myself like cry and begin to start to heal a little bit more. And the reason I tell it that is that I never met her, and she had no idea that that story that she told 3 years before was going to find somebody at the very moment that they needed it. And so the story is the basic unit of human understanding. And so make sure that you share your story, because you may think it's unimportant, you may think it's not as impressive as other people's, but you have no idea how a piece of your experience may be exactly what somebody else needs. And by sharing your story, you're demonstrating your leadership, because you're putting your wisdom and experience into the world. And maybe we were taught for a long time the best thing we can do is to make people look at us and say, oh, wow, I didn't know that. It's not. It's giving people the chance to look at us and say, oh, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was the only one afraid, hurt, hiding that. So I kind of went all over there. I had a much better answer in my head as you were asking the question. And then I started thinking about her. But that's, I think, the key pieces I want people to take out of that is that my book is published because someone loved me and believed in me more than I believed in myself. And she's gone now. But that's a better gift she could have given me than I realized at the time. So believe in the people you love. Do not allow people who you know are people of worth to diminish themselves in front of you. Go out and never let that happen. I think that's key.
Boy, I'll tell you, Drew, that is so powerful. And you know what I really appreciate is, the fact that you got vulnerable on this. I mean, that was a
little more than I expected.
Exactly. No, but I really appreciate that. And it is tough. You're out there talking about leadership all the time, and people forget about the fact that you're human is just like everybody else is. But boy, I'll tell you, there's power in your pain and wisdom in your wounds. I love that. I even wrote it down. Hey, Drew, I just want to thank you for being on today. This has just been absolutely awesome. Sorry about what happened last week. I had a power outage, and then all of a sudden, a half an hour later, it came back. So we didn't. So those of you who were on last week, that's exactly what happened. But Drew, I can't thank you enough. You've been absolutely terrific. And for the audience, we're going to try to do this monthly. We're going to try to have various leaders that are on future live streams. So be looking out for that. And all I can say is until then, have a positive influence on everybody around you. Drew, I think you'd agree with that too.
I would. And I just want to give you your honorary Canadian props for apologizing for something over which you had absolutely zero control. I was just like, my friend, you are one of us now. And you're just sort of like, yeah, sorry for that thing happening that I have no responsibility for. So, man, thank you. Congratulations on the book. Everybody go out and get it, because this man lives what he's talking about. And I also want to thank you, man, because we didn't really talk much about my work. You just gave me the chance to sort of wax poetic on leadership in general. And I hope that people still like that. But I want to say thank you, because what you're doing is giving people a platform to share their stories. So that thing I encourage people to do, you make that possible. So give yourself some credit there too, my friend. You are a leader, and thanks for letting me be a part of that mission for you.
Thanks, pal. Thanks, everybody. We'll be on next month. Take care.